Having detailed substance dualism as a view in providing the attainability of the three criteria of theory acceptance, I will now turn to several arguments against substance dualism to see if the view can still hold comparatively to the other two, that being physicalism and epiphenominalism. Now quickly, let's look at 4 objections typically leveled against substance dualism. First, it is sometimes suggested that physicalism is simpler, and thus appealing to an immaterial causal mind is contrary to Occam's Razor. However, there appears to be at least 2 main problems appealing to Occam's Razor against substance dualism, in my mind. Initially, such an appeal seems to be question-begging when applied to this debate, since the dualist cites several phenomena for which physicalism as a theory is inadequate, for example, first-person subjective perspective or intentionality. Thus, the dualist should hold to Occam's Razor, but should also remind the objector that dualism is suggested as it accounts for several uneliminable features of human beings. Second, if an objector attempts to shift the burden of proof onto the dualist via Occam's Razor, then it should be noted that the incorrigible private first-person axis of mental states are explicable only outside of physicalism, and thus the burden of proof may very well be on the physicalist. It is also important to note here the third criteria of theory acceptance, which is epistemic values. Rival hypotheses can differ radically about the nature, application, and relative importance of a particular epistemic value. Thus, in arguing against theory B, it may be inappropriate for advocates of theory A to cite its superior comportment with an epistemic value when B's proponents do not weigh that value as heavily as they do a different one, which they take to be more central to B. For example, given epiphenominalism and physicalism, if physicalism is simpler than epiphenominalism, but epiphenominalism is more descriptively accurate than physicalism, then it may be inappropriate for physicalists to cite their simplicity as grounds for judging it superior to epiphenominalism, for physicalism is not as descriptively accurate as, say, epiphenominalism. Concisely then, both Occam's Razor, simplicity, and descriptive accurateness are important epistemic values. However, it is inappropriate and question-begging to hold one value over another in order to dismiss a theory. A second objection against substance dualism, following column again, objects to substance dualism by suggesting that if God is the brute originator of finite human consciousness, then why God and not some other finite human mind? On inspection of this objection, it quickly becomes apparent that if human consciousness were indeed originated by other finite human consciousness, then this would create a vicious infinite regress. However, since the transversing of an actual infinite cannot be done, then the regress must be finite, thus it requires there to be a first member. But why God? Simply because, quote, the sort of regress we are considering is one that is vis-a-vis relevant to the ordering of the regress members. Thus, the stopping place must be unique and different from all the others, end quote, G.P. Moreland. Now, since each finite consciousness is contingent with respect to its existence and with respect to the fact that consciousness was actualized in it, such contingency disqualifies finite conscious beings from the position of first mover. Therefore, a necessary being, meaning a being who is not contingent in either his existence or actualization, is a proper first mover. A third possible objection is the problem of interaction. This objection suggests that we have no idea how to explain the interaction between the mind and the brain, two radically different entities, and thus substance dualism is nothing more than a description. This is a very, very popular objection. Remember, as already mentioned, however, the substance dualist postulates a personal explanation where a rational agent brings about minds via an intentional mediated action. This phenomena would explain the presence of the mind, but what about the interaction between the two entities? It seems to me that the interaction between the two entities is most likely direct and immediate. In other words, the objector is searching for some intervening mechanism between the mind and the brain. However, such a mechanism probably does not exist because of the direct interaction between the two substances. Thus, the how question does not even arise as the relationship is direct and immediate. Fourth and lastly, it is sometimes argued that damage to the brain is evidence that the mind is nothing more than what epiphenomenalism says it is, namely a supervenient entity or property of the brain. However, all that seems to follow from brain damage is simply that there is a correlation between brain and mental states, which is something that I've alluded to already, via the causal nature of the mind on the brain. For example, a nail being thrust through your skull will cause the mind state of feeling pain, of being in pain, and the brain state of action potential initiating pain reflexes or other symptoms of brain damage. What this signifies, however, is not necessarily the conclusion that the mind states are reducible to brain states. Rather, we can also conclude that the brain may serve as a mechanism to manifest the mind, much in the same way as a television manifests pictures and sound into the air. If an injury to the brain causes a person to lose some aspect of his mind or personality, this doesn't necessarily prove that the brain was the source of the mind. All this shows is that the apparatus is damaged. Thus, in the case of brain damage, the mind may very well be undamaged. It is simply the mechanism that manifests such personality and memory that is damaged, i.e. the brain. Thus, the mind may very well be functioning without the physical brain, arguably. Concisely, then, I conclude my inductive argument as follows. First, substance dualism meets the three criteria of theory acceptance, where physicalism and epiphenominalism do not. Second, the nature of substance dualist hypotheses is arguably less problematic than either physicalism or epiphenominalism, as hopefully demonstrated in this and previous parts. Moreover, the arguments against substance dualism have adequate responses. Thus, to conclude, human consciousness seems best explained by the rival hypothesis of substance dualism, given the arguments above, which inferentially offer evidence for God's existence.